You know, when you think about importing a piece of like high-end art from one culture to another.
Right, or a sleek, futuristic concept.
Yeah, exactly. You usually expect the people receiving it to handle it with a certain degree of reverence, you know?
You preserve it.
You try to emulate the original design.
Right, yeah, you keep it pristine.
But when you look at the history of electronic dance music, specifically how the Netherlands reacted to imported American techno in the late 1980s, that reverence completely vanishes.
Oh, it goes completely out the window.
Okay, let's unpack this. Importing that sleek, futuristic U.S. techno to the Netherlands was essentially like buying a pristine luxury sports car only for the local DJs to immediately rip out the engine.
Right, and replace it with a stolen jet turbine.
Yes. And they didn't do it just to make the car go faster either. They fundamentally rewired the mechanics so the sheer vibration of the engine would be violent enough to literally crack the concrete underneath the tires.
I mean, they weaponized the machinery, basically. They took this incredibly polished, aspirational American sound, which, was designed for high-end urban clubs, and they mutated it into this grueling industrial endurance test.
Which gave birth to something completely unprecedented. So welcome to today's deep dive.
Glad to be here.
We are exploring a truly fascinating column published in February 2026 by Monumental Movement Records, or MMR. It's this deep historical exploration into the origins of gabber and hardcore techno.
It's a fantastic piece of writing.
It really is. And our mission today for you, the listener, is to look past the intimidating, extreme speed of this music. We're going to uncover how a city's architectural reconstruction, its working-class labor force, and newly accessible technology accidentally birthed one of Europe's most radical and arguably most misunderstood dance subcultures.
Yeah, because this is far more than just a music history lesson. It is a profound case study for you to consider about how the physical environments we live and work in absolutely dictate the art we create.
Right.
I mean, it proves that the concrete around us literally shapes the sound waves we produce.
So, to really understand why the Dutch felt this overwhelming need to push the sonic speed limit, we have to look at the global electronic landscape in the late 1980s.
The whole scene was shifting.
Right. You've got Chicago house and Detroit techno crossing the Atlantic and arriving in Europe. And the moment this sophisticated futuristic music hits European soil, it splinters.
It fractures completely. Germany takes that American sound and strips it down to its barest bones. They emphasize a very precise, engineered, minimal repetition.
Right. Very clean.
Very clean. Now, the UK goes in a totally different direction, embracing scattered breakbeats and tying the music heavily into their massive, muddy, outdoor rave culture.
But then you have the Netherlands.
Exactly. The Netherlands developed this intense, almost singular obsession with pure hardness, just relentless speed.
I just don't get it, though. I mean, Detroit techno was actively trying to paint a picture of a sleek, technological utopia. It was sophisticated. Why take that beautiful, clean sound and purposefully mutate it so it sounds like a runaway freight train crashing into a brick wall?
Right.
Why prioritize chaotic destruction over the original creator's intent?
Well, because the Dutch DJs weren't just playing these imported records for a polite, sitting crowd. They were actively dismantling them live on the warehouse floor.
Live.
Yeah, live. They would manipulate the pitch fader on their turntables. Now, sliding a pitch fader forces the physical vinyl record to spin faster.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which artificially raises both the tempo and the pitch into this frenetic, almost unnatural territory. It sounds sort of warped.
Right, like Alvin and the Chipmunks, but aggressive.
Exactly. Then they would grab the low-end EQs on their mixing boards, the dials controlling the bass, and crank them so far past the red line that the club's speakers would physically distort.
Just intentionally blowing out the speaker.
Pretty much. They were intentionally pushing the beats per minute, the BPM, well past 140.
That's incredibly fast.
It is. Keep in mind, 140 BPM is already a highly demanding pace for a human cardiovascular system to just keep up with.
They were turning a rhythmic groove into a physical assault.
That's exactly what it was.
The beats became incredibly rigid, right? Like very linear. It wasn't about a subtle swaying rhythm anymore. It was about treating the music as a blunt instrument meant to directly impact the human body.
What's fascinating here is that this shift completely moved the creation of the music away from the careful isolation of recording studios.
How so?
Well, this wasn't a producer sitting alone tweaking a synthesizer for 3 weeks to achieve perfect acoustic balance.
Right. It wasn't delicate.
No, this was live, messy experimentation.
Yeah.
The DJ would push the tempo, the crowd would react with this explosive energy, and that immediate visceral feedback loop dictated where the music went next.
So the crowd was essentially co-producing the track in real time.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
The criteria for a good track changed instantly from structural beauty to immediate destructive efficacy. Does it make the room explode? Yes or no?
But that relentless demand for speed and destruction wasn't happening in a vacuum, right?
Not at all.
It was the direct physical result of the specific gritty environment of one particular city. And that's Rotterdam.
Yes, Rotterdam.
The history of Rotterdam itself actually provides the answer to why they needed this sound.
You really cannot separate the sound of Gabber from the concrete of Rotterdam. It's impossible. During the bombardments of World War II, the city lost nearly all of its historic center.
It was leveled.
Completely leveled. So when the time came to rebuild, the city planners weren't thinking about intricate, delicate aesthetics, or historical preservation.
They poured concrete.
Endless concrete.
They built these wide, brutalist structures for pure, unadulterated practicality and function.
And beyond the uncompromising architecture, you have to remember Rotterdam is a massive port city.
Right. Huge industrial presence.
Exactly. At the time, it had a massive working-class population. You have thousands of young people doing grueling night shifts, engaged in heavy, taxing physical labor on the docks.
Operating massive cranes, hauling cargo, that kind of thing.
Yeah, real backbreaking work.
I mean, if you're a teenager hauling steel and operating heavy machinery for 60 hours a week, a polite, sophisticated cocktail lounge isn't going to help you unwind.
Definitely not.
A gentle, ambient soundscape just isn't going to cut it when Friday night rolls around. You have all this pent-up muscular tension from the week. You need an explosive release.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this sonic assault was a vital social release valve. For working-class youth, subjecting themselves to this punishing sound was an absolute survival mechanism.
Survival mechanism.
Yeah, it was a way to reclaim the exhaustion of their physical labor. Instead of letting the industrial machinery break them down, they internalized the sound of that machinery.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Right. And they used it to sweat out their frustrations on their own terms on the dance floor.
Which brings us to the defining sonic signature of this entire movement, right? The distorted kick drum.
The legendary Gabber kick.
Yeah. In Rotterdam, the kick drum wasn't treated as a musical pitch. It wasn't a melody you could hum along to. It was treated as a physical mass.
Like a concrete block.
Exactly. It was a sonic object designed to violently hit the listener's chest. It's like the music was literally translating the rhythm of heavy dock machinery and pile drivers into a blunt force audio form.
The mechanism behind that sound is brilliant, actually. When producers got their hands on cheap drum machines, they didn't just press play and use the factory sounds.
What do they do?
They ran the kick drum through heavy audio compression.
Okay, for those who don't know, what does that actually do?
Well, compression essentially squashes a sound wave. It takes the loudest peak of a sound and the quietest tail end and forces them together.
So it flattens it out.
Yeah, it flattens and fattens it. So instead of a short, punchy thump, you get a massive, sustained, aggressive roar. They transformed a standard drum beat into a solid block of distorted noise.
Wow. And the incredible irony is that this hostile, aggressive-sounding music birthed a culture rooted entirely in deep friendship and solidarity.
That's the best part.
Even the name of the genre reflects this. The word gabber actually comes from Yiddish and Dutch Bargoens slang, and it literally translates to mate or friend.
That linguistic detail is the perfect key to understanding the whole subculture. To an outsider, the music sounded like a riot.
Absolute chaos.
Pure chaos. But to the kids inside the warehouse, it was a massive gathering of friends surviving the weekend together.
Yeah.
But building an entire subculture around a 160 BPM endurance test creates a logistical problem.
Right. How do you consistently manufacture that level of sonic exhaustion, and how do you physically survive it?
Exactly. And that forces the scene to standardize between 1992 and 1994. Suddenly, the toolkit becomes incredibly accessible. We're talking about the proliferation of relatively cheap samplers from companies like Akai and Roland.
So you no longer needed $1 million recording studio to make a record.
No, not at all. You just needed a few $100, a bedroom, and a lot of pent-up energy.
Crafting that iconic Gabber kick drum became an artisan craft, didn't it?
It really did. Teenagers in their bedrooms were taking existing drum samples, intentionally distorting them, aggressively compressing them, and then layering them over and over.
Just stacking the noise?
Yeah, stacking it. It was a highly technical, destructive process that allowed individual producers to develop their own signature, bone-rattling low end.
Now, while the music was becoming this highly compressed, distorted weapon, the physical culture, like the fashion, the haircuts, the way people moved, had to adapt to the reality of standing in an unventilated warehouse being battered by 160 beats per minute for 8 hours straight.
It was a crucible.
The iconic Gabber uniform wasn't born out of a fashion magazine, right? It was born out of pure biological necessity.
Completely. You would walk into a club and see a sea of completely shaved heads or extremely short haircuts
Because of the heat.
because of the heat. A club packed with thousands of people dancing at extreme speeds generates a dangerous amount of heat and sweat. Hair is simply a liability in that environment.
Right, it's just impractical. And the same goes for the clothes. Everyone was in identical, loose-fitting tracksuits and heavily cushioned sneakers.
Air Maxes were huge.
Yeah. The core philosophy was using overshowing. You wore clothes that allowed you to physically endure a 12-hour marathon of jumping. You didn't wear clothes to show off your wealth or status.
And the dancing itself reflected this pure utility. It wasn't about individual expression, and it certainly wasn't about looking graceful.
I've seen the videos. It's intense.
Very intense. The crowds engaged in asynchronous, repetitive jumping, literally throwing their entire bodies against the rhythm.
A hack-in, right?
Right, hacking. It generated a massive collective high.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You have this scene in Rotterdam that is entirely focused on a punishing physical ordeal. The music is hostile, the dancing is exhausting, the aesthetic is aggressive. Yet it created one of the most powerful, unified group euphorias in European music history. The shared suffering bred unbreakable solidarity, but how much of that solidarity was actually fueled by their shiny cosmopolitan neighbor?
Ah.
Because you cannot talk about Rotterdam Gabber without talking about its absolute antithesis, Amsterdam.
You really can't. Amsterdam was busy embracing the sophisticated international house and techno sounds. It was refined. It was cosmopolitan. It was about being seen at the right club in the right outfit.
Very image conscious.
Very. And Rotterdam Gabber deliberately positioned itself as a rebellion against Amsterdam's perceived elitism. In Amsterdam, the ultimate criteria for a track was, can you dance to it?
And in Rotterdam.
In Rotterdam, the criteria was, can you endure it?
Did this intense, bitter rivalry with Amsterdam actually isolate Rotterdam, or did it give the Gabber scene the exact friction it needed to thrive?
Well, the media certainly loved painting it as a tribal war.
Of course they did.
The sophisticated Amsterdam elite versus the barbaric Rotterdam working class. It makes for great headlines. But the reality on the ground was far more nuanced.
Kids were traveling, right?
Constantly. Kids constantly traveled between the two cities. There was a huge amount of cross-pollination and shared ideas. That constant friction actually provided the ultimate vitality for the scene. Rotterdam defined what it was fighting for by clearly establishing what it was fighting against.
But when a youth culture defines itself by extreme speeds, distorted noise, and thousands of kids marching in identical tracksuits with shaved heads, the outside world is going to completely misread the room.
Oh, inevitably.
The mainstream media is absolutely bound to panic.
And panic they did. By 1995, Gabber hit a massive commercial peak in the Netherlands. It moved out of the underground warehouses and into massive stadium-sized raves.
Thunderdome.
Exactly, Thunderdome. And this is when the media misunderstanding reaches a fever pitch.
They looked at Gabber and only saw the intimidating surface. News broadcasts would show footage of the violent-looking aesthetic, the aggressive stomping dance moves, the shaved heads.
Right, out of context, it looks scary.
Yeah, and they immediately and incorrectly associated it with political extremism, hooliganism, and societal decay.
They flattened an incredibly complex artisan youth culture into a single, terrifying stereotype. The media completely missed the intricate musical experimentation happening with the samplers.
You just didn't see the art in it.
No, they couldn't understand the psychological catharsis. They just heard terrifying noise and saw aggression.
And that kind of intense external pressure, combined with the inevitable burnout of a massive commercial peak, forces a culture to fracture.
It has to.
You can't stay at maximum capacity in a stadium forever. So by 1998, the scene splinters into these wild subgenres. You get happy hardcore, which takes the speed but layers it with bright, catchy, almost cartoonish pop melodies for the mainstream.
It was huge on the charts.
Right. But then in response to that, you get darkcore, industrial hardcore, and speedcore.
Now, speedcore is where the experimentation reaches avant-garde levels. Producers were pushing the tempo to 300, 400, even 500 beats per minute.
That doesn't even sound like music anymore.
It basically turns the kick drum into a continuous, vibrating drone of noise. It became a pure assault on the senses. And as the music became more extreme, the scene naturally left the massive mainstream arenas and retreated back to the smaller, darker underground clubs.
Often when a music scene leaves the mainstream spotlight, people say the subculture is shrinking or dying. But the MMR column suggests a totally different way to look at it.
A much better way, I think.
This wasn't a shrinking, it was a concentration. By shedding the mainstream tourists who were just there for the trend, the culture concentrated its core energy. It became a highly sustainable, fiercely dedicated movement for its true fans.
And that concentration is what allowed the culture to survive long term. And while it was digging back into the underground in Europe, the physical records were actually being exported globally.
Yes, this is crazy.
The most phenomenal chapter of this story is how this abrasive, deeply Dutch sound made its way to Japan in the mid-1990s via imported vinyl and underground magazines.
So what does this all mean? It means a hyper-specific working-class Rotterdam sound acted almost like an open-source code for rebellion. Kids in Tokyo and Osaka didn't just passively mimic the Dutch sound, right? They downloaded the sonic architecture and remixed it to fit their own cultural needs.
They proved Gabber could be culturally translated. The Japanese scene took the raw 180 BPM distorted kick drum of Rotterdam, but they stripped away the grim industrial tracksuit aesthetic.
They changed the visual language.
Completely. They fused the extreme speed with their own local sensibilities. They started layering the aggressive beats with hyperkinetic video game synth lines and chopped up anime vocal samples.
And they replaced the shaved heads and purely functional warehouse gear with complex, brightly colored fashion and heavy theatrical makeup inspired by visual kei.
It was a complete visual reimagining of the same sonic violence. It validates Gabber as a universal language of extreme release.
It really does.
It proves you can take the industrial pressure of a European port city, hand it to a teenager in Tokyo, and they will use it to blow off the steam of their own high-pressure, neon-lit urban environment.
Which perfectly bridges the gap to how modern music producers view Gabber today. Moving into the 2010s and right up to the present day, the 1990s hardcore sound has undergone a massive critical reevaluation.
It really has.
The very things that terrified the mainstream media in 1995, the sheer, unbridled excess, the punishing speed, the deliberate rejection of traditional musicality, are now viewed by modern techno producers and experimental artists as an expression of pure, unfiltered sincerity.
Because if you think about the electronic music of the modern era, with endless digital software, everything could be perfectly pitch-corrected, perfectly timed, and infinitely polished.
Right, it's flawless.
But that pristine perfection can sometimes feel incredibly sterile. It lacks a human pulse. So modern producers are looking backward at the raw, distorted, messy 160 BPM chaos of early Rotterdam Gabber, and they see it as incredibly honest.
It was music made with cheap gear by kids who were exhausted, trying to literally vibrate the walls of a warehouse. That old, gritty rebellion has become a vital reference point for new musical experimentation.
It's a foundational text now.
It proves that Gabber is an incomplete culture, a constantly evolving framework that continues to be reinterpreted across different eras and different continents.
It all loops back to our core mission for you today. The environments you inhabit, the physical work you do, and the practical realities of your daily life inevitably and forcefully shape the art you create.
Absolutely.
Rotterdam's concrete, its brutal night shifts, and its heavy dock labor didn't just quietly influence Gabber. They forged it. The music was the sound of the city, literally speaking back to itself.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We've seen how the 1990s Gabber scene was a blistering physical reaction to the exhaustion of heavy, muscular labor and brutalist urban reconstruction. So, what kind of extreme sonic culture is currently bubbling under the surface right now, acting as a reaction to today's era of sedentary digital exhaustion? What happens when the pressure cooker making you crazy isn't a factory floor or a dockyard, but a glowing screen and a 24-hour notification cycle?
The need for catharsis never goes away. It just changes shape to match the new machinery.
Maybe instead of ripping the engine out of the sports car, the next generation will figure out how to short-circuit the entire digital grid. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extreme, fascinating world of Gabber. We'll catch you next time.